You think you know the darkest depth of human cruelty? You are completely wrong. The real horror didn't happen on battlefields, but on tiny, isolated strips of land, hidden far away. Governments used these remote islands as human dumping grounds. A ticket here meant you were already dead. Today, we are reopening these terrifying cold cases. And the island at number 1.
We usually picture islands as tropical paradises, but for millions of condemned souls, surrounded by water meant absolute, inescapable hell. Welcome to the frozen shores of Nazino, a desolate Siberian death trap where thousands were dumped without food or shelter. The freezing mud quickly swallowed their desperate hopes, leaving them to survive a brutal winter with absolutely nothing but river water. Guards mercilessly shot anyone trying to build a raft, trapping them on this tiny, barren strip of frozen, blood-soaked earth. This crude wooden cross marks the exact spot where human morality completely collapsed under the weight of unimaginable, freezing starvation. As weeks passed, the desperate prisoners realized that the only available meat on this dead island was actually each other. This rusted cup once held rations, but soon became a grim tool for survival on what history remembers as Cannibal Island. From the sky, this isolated strip of land looks completely harmless, successfully hiding the darkest, most terrifying secrets of humanity. A heavy, suffocating fog rolls over the muddy shores, perfectly mirroring the crushing despair felt by those abandoned here forever. The cracked, freezing earth still holds the terrifying echoes of thousands who were left to freeze and starve to death. Even the collapsing watchtowers cannot erase the horrific memories of guards watching innocent people slowly turn into desperate, starving monsters. But the freezing cold of Siberia is not the only way an isolated island can completely destroy the human mind. Deep within the suffocating heat of the South American jungle lie the rotting, cursed ruins of the notorious Salvation Islands. Inside these dark, impossibly narrow stone cells, French prisoners endured a living nightmare known to the world as Devil's Island. Thick tropical vines now choke the rusted iron bars, just as deadly tropical diseases once choked the life from inmates. Surrounded by shark-infested oceans and impenetrable jungle, escaping this humid, disease-ridden penal colony was considered an absolute, impossible suicide mission. Prisoners were locked inside roofless cells, totally exposed to the brutal, burning tropical sun and relentless, torrential monsoon rains daily. Deep scratch marks clawed into these heavy wooden doors reveal the terrifying, agonizing madness that eventually consumed every single prisoner. The blinding midday sun casts deep, inescapable shadows over courtyards where men were routinely worked to their absolute physical breaking points. Heavy, rusted iron chains remain abandoned on the wet stone, permanent monuments to the brutal, unforgiving suffering endured down here. Stepping through this ruined stone archway feels like walking directly into the open, rotting jaws of a forgotten, tropical hell. Dense jungle canopy actively hides the collapsing prison blocks, as if nature itself is desperately trying to bury the horrific past. But not all island prisons hide in the jungle. Some stand completely exposed beneath the blinding, merciless Mediterranean summer sun. Welcome to Goli Otok, a barren, jagged rock in the Adriatic Sea that served as a brutal, top-secret political gulag. The completely destroyed concrete cell blocks perfectly reflect the violently shattered minds of the unfortunate prisoners who were sent here. Inmates were forced to perform meaningless, agonizing physical labor under the scorching sun until their bodies simply gave out completely. Rusted iron door frames stand completely alone, skeletal remains of a highly classified torture camp the government desperately tried to hide. Dust dances silently in the abandoned industrial workshops where exhausted prisoners were systematically stripped of their basic human dignity forever. Faded warning signs still hang crookedly on rusted fences, silent witnesses to decades of unimaginable political terror and psychological destruction. Walking down this blindingly bright, empty corridor, you can almost hear the terrified whispers of the forgotten men trapped inside. The sun-baked, peeling paint perfectly illustrates the extreme, arid heat that slowly tortured prisoners who were denied basic drinking water. Inside the blinding white limestone quarry, prisoners were forced to break heavy rocks barehanded until their bleeding fingers completely shattered. From high above, this jagged, rocky wasteland looks like an alien planet, totally devoid of any hope, mercy, or escape. But the most terrifying island prisons weren't built above ground. They were deliberately buried deep beneath the Earth's damp surface. Looking down through these heavy rusted grates reveals the horrific, claustrophobic nightmare of the infamous hidden tropical tiger cages today. Prisoners were crammed into these tiny, suffocating concrete pits, forced to live in their own filth under the sweltering heat. Guards routinely poured burning quicklime and dirty water down through the iron grates, violently blinding and burning the helpless prisoners. A heavy padlock and thick iron chain secured the grated doors, ensuring nobody could ever escape this subterranean torture chamber. Yellow colonial plaster masks the dark, blood-soaked history of this prison gate, where thousands walked in but rarely walked out. Dark green mold now covers the walls of solitary cells where inmates were systematically starved and brutally beaten in darkness. Rusted leg irons remain permanently bolted to the decaying concrete beds, a terrifying reminder of absolute physical and mental control. Walking down this claustrophobic, pitch-black corridor, the heavy, rusted metal doors feel like the entrance to a massive underground tomb. Through this tiny, rusted sliding hatch, prisoners received their only meager rations, barely enough to keep them alive for torture. Heavy monsoon rains now violently wash over the decaying, overgrown compound, slowly erasing the physical evidence of these horrific crimes. Hidden deep within the dense tropical foliage, these subterranean cages were kept entirely secret from the outside world for decades. The glaring white limestone reflects the brutal heat, turning the entire prison courtyard into a massive, inescapable outdoor baking oven. Looking out through thick vertical iron bars, prisoners saw only blinding white rock, slowly driving them into a state of madness. Some cells appeared deceptively clean, completely hiding the intense psychological torture inflicted through total sensory deprivation and extreme, absolute silence. Highly polished floors in these empty corridors reflect the terrifying, clinical efficiency with which this island prison systematically broke humans. A heavy, complex brass lock securing the thick wooden door guaranteed that begging for mercy would never be heard outside. High concrete walls and incredibly sharp razor wire completely surround the dusty exercise yard, constantly reminding inmates of their permanent cage. Staring through the rusted chain-link fence, the oppressive, completely isolated prison building looks like a fortress of absolute, inescapable despair. Extremely sharp, heavily rusted razor wire sits starkly against the blue sky, ready to tear the flesh of anyone attempting escape. The desolate, unpaved road leading to the massive prison gates perfectly symbolizes a terrifying, one-way journey into permanent, forgotten darkness. Inside the peeling, blue-tiled communal showers, prisoners were routinely humiliated and brutally assaulted away from the prying eyes of guards. From the sky, the massive, geometric prison complex dominates the flat, dry island, looking like a terrifying concrete military fortress. Halfway across the world, heavy, freezing rain falls on the dark, ruined brick walls of a notorious 1800s penal station. Crumbling, dark red handmade bricks, now covered in thick moss, were built by the very convicts they were designed to torture. A dark, tannin-stained river flows past the isolated penal island, its freezing waters drowning anyone brave enough to attempt swimming. Inside this roofless, extremely claustrophobic brick solitary cell, convicts were left in total darkness until they completely lost their minds. Rusted iron spikes still aggressively protrude from the decaying brick walls, threatening any desperate soul who dared to climb them. A ruined cobblestone path leads deep into the dark, wet forest, hiding the collapsing, terrifying remains of a brutal colonial nightmare. Deep, freezing water constantly laps against the rotting wooden pilings, an incredibly grim reminder of the absolute, inescapable isolation here. This dark, arched brick entrance leads straight into the subterranean solitary block, known by terrified prisoners simply as the Black Hole. A heavily rusted iron ring bolted to the mossy floor was used to brutally chain prisoners in the freezing, absolute darkness. Rotting wooden beams continuously collapse inward within this ruined brick building, as the dark, wet forest aggressively reclaims the tortured land. Shrouded in heavy fog, the decaying brick ruins of this island penal station look like a terrifying, cursed ghost town today. In the freezing north, a massive, ancient brick monastery was violently transformed into one of the most brutal prison camps ever. Heavy, ancient wooden doors reinforced with rusted iron bands trap political prisoners inside incredibly freezing, completely unheated stone prison cells. Down this dark, narrow stone corridor, the freezing temperature alone was often enough to kill the weakest, most vulnerable inmates. The stark white snow and frozen sea perfectly contrast with the terrifying dark stone buildings of this inescapable, deadly island gulag. Rusted barbed wire is tightly strung between crude wooden posts, fiercely guarding the freezing, snow-covered landscape from any desperate escapes. Frost aggressively covers the brick walls inside this abandoned holding cell, where freezing to death was considered a merciful exit. Looking through the rusted iron grate at the snow-covered courtyard, prisoners knew they would likely never survive the brutal winter. A crude, isolated wooden guard tower stands against the dark, snowy sky, keeping a merciless watch over the freezing, starving prisoners. The freezing, dark waters of the White Sea violently crash against the massive stone fortress walls, totally eliminating any escape hopes. Freezing rain forms thick, heavy ice over the rusted iron padlock, permanently sealing the heavy wooden prison gates during brutal winters. Circled by the freezing ocean, this imposing brick fortress successfully hid the absolute worst atrocities of a terrifying, ruthless regime. Even the most famous island prison in the world, Alcatraz, successfully broke its inmates through a unique, incredibly cruel psychological torture. Incredibly thick layers of peeling, lead-based paint heavily coat the solid steel cell doors, hiding decades of desperate, violent anger. Inside this tiny, incredibly claustrophobic cell, prisoners spent years staring blankly at a rusted toilet and a decaying fold-out bed. The wide, empty dining hall was always considered the most dangerous room, where extreme violence could erupt in an absolute instant. Heavy San Francisco fog rolls directly through the open, rusted windows, bringing a terrifying, freezing chill into the abandoned cell block. A complex, heavily rusted mechanical locking system efficiently controlled the massive row of cells, operating with terrifying, cold industrial precision. The heavily reinforced steel doors of D-block solitary confinement hid the absolute worst, completely pitch-black nightmare a prisoner could face. Through the rusted bars and dirty glass, inmates could literally hear the cheerful sounds of the city they could never reach. The heavily rusted, incredibly thick iron keyhole on the solitary door guaranteed that once closed, the terrifying darkness was completely absolute. Inside the cracked, abandoned shower room, the dark, damp atmosphere perfectly captures the extreme tension and constant fear of sudden violence. Surrounded entirely by thick, rolling ocean fog, this imposing concrete fortress looks like an incredibly terrifying, isolated island of doom. In Central America, a decaying concrete prison is currently being completely swallowed by the dense, aggressive, unforgiving Panamanian jungle canopy. A rusted, abandoned machete lying on the damp concrete floor hints at the extreme, brutal violence that once ruled this colony. Sunlight pours violently through the completely collapsed roof, illuminating the rubble-strewn floor where desperate men once slept in absolute terror. Decades of thick grime heavily stain the walls of this dark, humid holding pen, where tropical diseases spread incredibly fast. A decaying concrete guard post is now being totally strangled by thick tropical vines, successfully erasing the terrifying, violent past. Desperate, incredibly sad graffiti aggressively scratched into the peeling plaster reveals the completely shattered minds of the doomed men trapped inside. This dark, terrifyingly long concrete tunnel leads directly to the isolation blocks, a place where prisoners routinely entered but rarely returned. Rusted, completely broken iron bed frames lie piled up in the ruined dormitory, totally surrounded by aggressive weeds and creeping jungle. The dark, decaying concrete walls violently rise out of the dense green jungle, looking like an incredibly ancient, cursed temple ruin. Thick green moss and aggressive tropical fungus rapidly grow over a heavily rusted iron lock, perfectly showcasing nature's unstoppable reclamation process. Flying extremely low over the jungle canopy reveals the terrifying, hidden rotting concrete structures of an incredibly brutal, forgotten island prison. Inside this completely pitch-black isolation cell, a single flashlight beam violently exposes the deeply scratched, incredibly dirty, terrifying concrete walls. The completely rusted iron food tray slot perfectly highlights the incredibly dark, oppressive, and utterly hopeless nature of this extreme confinement. Inside the terrifyingly empty, heavily echoing concrete cell block, peeling paint constantly falls to the floor like an incredibly toxic snow. A severely broken, heavily rusted security mirror hangs loosely in the dark hallway, hopelessly reflecting an incredibly desolate, deeply terrifying corridor. Dark, incredibly terrifying stains remain permanently etched into the isolation cell floor, offering a grim, silent testament to unspeakable horrors. The completely shattered remains of a dirty toilet bowl sit uselessly in the corner of this filthy, completely abandoned prison cell. Covered in decades of heavy rust and deep dents, this solid steel solitary door looks incredibly heavy, totally intimidating, and impenetrable. A towering, rapidly decaying concrete wall, heavily topped with completely rusted, highly dangerous razor wire, perfectly blocks the gray, depressing sky. Dried, deeply cracked paint aggressively curls off the damp wall, painfully revealing the harsh, incredibly cold, completely unforgiving raw concrete underneath. From high above, this massive, completely decaying concrete structure sits totally isolated on a barren island, entirely forgotten by the world. The horrific legacy of these terrifying penal islands proves that humanity is perfectly capable of creating absolute hell right here on Earth. And as nature finally reclaims these dark, bloody ruins, the terrifying screams of the condemned are forever silenced by the crashing waves.